Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a couple of questions. What does Israel's war on Gaza say about U.S. foreign policy? And what are the long-term consequences for the region and the world? Let's get to the bottom line. October 7th and its aftermath will definitely go down in history as a turning point for the Middle East. Hamas's attack and Israel's all-out war on Gaza have forced countries around the world to rethink their priorities. For Israel, the plans to leapfrog over the Palestinians and integrate itself into the region are now on hold. For the U.S., its plans to pivot to Asia, to focus on China, and avoid getting dragged back into the Middle East are also gone with the wind. So what are the far-reaching implications of the Gaza war, not only for the Palestinians and Israelis, and what happens next? Today, I'm talking with Jon Alterman, the director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
Let me just start out. You wrote a very powerful, interesting article. I want to have everyone go look at it. It's on the CSIS website called Israel Could Lose. The implication is Hamas could win. So tell us how Hamas could win.
Hamas's goal is not to defeat Israel on the battlefield in any near term. Hamas's goal is to arrest Israel's integration in the world, Israel's integration into the Middle East, to make Israel more isolated, to continue to put Israelis under pressure, to over the long term, create a situation where Palestinians are united around Hamas, the Palestinian Authority collapses, and Hamas can bring regional support, other support, to eventually conquer Jerusalem. What they did on October 7th was much more successful than they ever thought. But I think we have to consider just how long the high from that is likely to last. Egypt broke through the supposedly impregnable Bar-Lev line in 1973. They used water cannons to break through a sand berm that the Israelis thought the Egyptians never could cross, recaptured the Sinai briefly. The Israelis pushed back over and were 100 kilometers outside of Cairo, and yet the Egyptian military continues 50 years later to treat 1973 as their great achievement. Armed Forces Day is October 6th every year in Egypt. For 50 years, merely breaking through a defense was a victory. Hamas broke through the impenetrable Israeli fence in 29 places, with using techniques the Israelis never contemplated. The Israelis thought, we have this figured out. We have it figured out technologically. We have Hamas figured out. We know how to play with work permits. We know how to do all these things. Palestine is not on anybody's radar screen. We have one, and we're going to be doing not only the Abraham Accords, we'll do things with the Saudis, we're doing things with the Indians. We're in a different place. And Hamas's argument is, you're not going to be able to do that. We're going to drag you right back to this conflict. We're going to tear you apart from all of these alliances you've been building for the last 50 years. And you will suffer as we suffer, and we're ultimately going to win because we have more resolve than you do. That's what Hamas wants to do. They changed the parameters of this conflict, and Israel is committed to eradicating Hamas, but it's not really clear what that means or how you do that.
Well, I think when you kind of look at the question of eliminating Hamas, and almost everyone, I would say, in the Western world kind of agrees with that after the horror of what they saw on October 7th.
All the governments in the Arab world want to eliminate Hamas.
So they want to get rid of Hamas.
With only a small number, because here you have an armed group that embraces political Islam that's backed by the Iranians.
Right.
And for virtually all of the Arab governments, that makes them anathema. They would love to see Hamas gone.
But I think at the same time, when you look at the horror of what they unleashed on October 7th and the subterranean tectonics of essentially injustice and keeping a population in a vice, in a very, very high-pressure vice for a long time, in some places of the world, but I would also say the West Bank and among a lot of Palestinians, what Hamas did nonetheless feels good to them, feels legitimate to them. Is that a problem? Because if this becomes an ideology that's deeper, How do you separate Hamas from Palestine? And in part, that's what Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying, is he's, in a sense, saying all Palestinians are Hamas, right?
So, there's an argument in Israel, and I think there's some validity to it, that Netanyahu wanted to have both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. He wanted Hamas to demonstrate that you couldn't make peace with the Palestinians, but he wanted a relatively flexible Palestinian Authority on the West Bank to deal with, and sort of keep both tracks going and say, well, I can't really make a Palestinian deal because the Palestinians themselves aren't united. I think, to my mind, the brutality of Hamas delegitimizes the movement in a really profound way. I don't think there's an excuse for it. I spoke to somebody from my podcast earlier this week. I have a podcast called Babel, Translating the Middle East, and I spoke to somebody who grew up in Gaza, who will tell you all about the horrors of Gaza. It doesn't justify what Hamas did. I think some of the guys were high on Captagon. It's all kinds of issues involving what.
So are Gazans angry at what Hamas did now for triggering this hell and the destruction of their city?
And some say, as far as I can tell, some say just to show that we won't be trampled, that we have dignity, that we can fight back, is important. One of the important things, though, and this guy who I spoke to, Khalil Sayer, was talking about, when he was in Gaza, he never met an Israeli. The only Israeli he ever saw was in a jet flying overhead dropping bombs. That Gazans systematically never see Israelis. And so there's a whole world inside Gaza, and Hamas, since it took power in Gaza in 2005, has been creating its own reality, teaching its own narrative about Israel, its own theology about what society should be like, also distorting of Gazan society.
Where do you see, John, the big powers around this crisis? Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United States, Egypt? Because it seems to me, when you kind of look at this, one of the truth you've been talking about for decades is you can't just ignore this conflict. It will come screaming back and get you. And the Abraham Accords were sort of, as you wrote, kind of trying to ignore the Palestine equation. Palestine's come right back. But it seems to me that this conflict could go a number of directions that either enhance or detract from big powers around the conflict. How do you see the geopolitical context of this crisis?
So let me start with sort of Russia and China. I think China has had deepening relations with Israel for a long time. China, without question, has decided we're going to play the global South card. We're going to play the injustice card. China is very sympathetic to the Palestinian narrative, and playing this as China plays many of its international engagements by thinking, how does this affect the United States? If we can get an edge over the United States with audiences we care about, let's play it that way. And I think that's what China is doing. But I do think that China expects and will push to be included in whatever peace deal comes about. They're looking for prestige. They're looking for people to recognize China's role. So I think they'll be subtly pro-Palestinian, not necessarily pro-Hamas, but
which is strange in a way, because what about China and Xinjiang? What about China and, what about its populations that it has in a vice?
And realistically, Chinese diplomats come to Middle Eastern states and they say, do not talk about it. And they say, okay. And they say, quiet the clerics down about it, and they do. So China is an interesting demonstration case for just how much power Middle Eastern governments have over both public opinion and over clerical opinion about things in the world. They've often said, oh, we can't do that. We have our public opinion. When they want to steer it, they do, and they certainly steer it on Xinjiang. So I think China is going to capitalize. They want to use this as a way to be recognized as a great power without doing the kinds of things that a great power would be expected to do. Russia, once again, a bottom feeder. They look at fragile places. They look for small advantages. I don't think they're playing any constructive role here. Saudi Arabia, realistically, the government is trying to tamp down some of the pro-Palestinian sentiment. They're trying to guide it. When I look at Saudi papers, the Saudi papers are not over the moon hostile to Israel. They're a little more deliberate. I think my understanding is their efforts.
Is that costing Saudi leadership anything with their own Arab Street? I mean, in a way, of course, the Saudis have long been opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, Hamas is looked at as an appendage or, fellow traveler with the Muslim Brotherhood. So you can understand that. But if your choice and partnership is that, we're going to become pro-Israel over Arabs, is that a problem for them?
Well, they're not pro-Israel. I think their argument is let's find a way to be sort of pro-Palestinian. They've halted things with Israel. I think they're not. They've told people, on the one hand, we're not ready to talk about post-conflict environment, helping the PA, and all those kinds of things. But they've also told some Americans who've been in the kingdom our strategic orientation toward having some sort of understanding with Israel remains in place. It's just suspended for now. The Emiratis as well, I think, trying to use ways to tamp down some of the sentiment without squashing it.
Right.
And both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are pretty sophisticated in the way they engage with social media and public sentiment. And I think they're trying to keep it within boundaries. Egypt and Jordan are two places that have, I think, a lot more public anger, and probably the government is less sophisticated in ways to shape it. I think they are worried. Egypt has a big role to play. Jordan has this historic connection with Palestine. I interviewed the Jordanian foreign minister a couple of weeks ago at CSIS. He almost never used the word Hamas and would only do it when directly pressed. It was all about Palestine, and his point was we have to use this as a way to push toward a two-state solution. I think ultimately Egypt is going to have to be the keystone of whatever happens next in Gaza in terms of logistics for reconstruction, in terms of governance. The Egyptians have their tentacles into Gaza through their intelligence links and other things that date back to when they controlled Gaza until 1967. But Egypt is a country with a whole bunch of problems, and financial and otherwise. And I think Egypt is going to be careful what it does. It's going to be trying to get things, but also serve its national interests. Let me just say one more thing. What I think a lot of this all highlights is the sustained centrality of the United States. There is clearly no country or collection of countries that can begin to do what the United States can do. Tony Blinken's been running around the world. I think he's been trying to bridge an increasingly large gap between the Israelis and the rest of the world, certainly between the Israelis and the Arab world.
How would you grade his? I see him running all around the world too and trying it, and I see him not getting as much traction as I would have thought the Secretary of State of the President of the United States getting. The second side of it is, where are the American people? Do they think that this global engagement is somehow paying off for them, or are they getting exhausted by it?
I am amazed at just how much attention, sustained attention, the Gaza war is attracting. The conventional wisdom in the Middle East, among other places, was that the world has washed its hands of this. Young people especially, they're interested in entertainment, they're interested in jobs. The Arab youth are over Palestine. That's an old issue. And I think this is one of a tiny number of issues in the world that can get billions of people exercised. Frankly, another issue, and it's strange, a strange parallel. I think LGBT issues are another issue that get billions of people exercised. I'm not sure there's another. Those are the only two I can think of. They're not similar at all, but I think they somehow speak deeply to something. It's sort of ingrained in people. It elicits this emotional reaction. I'm frankly surprised, because everything I have been hearing in the Middle East for more than 10 years, on every side of this equation, on the Israeli side, on the Arab side, Gulf Arabs, Levantine Arabs, it's there, but it's not It's not a motivating issue. And I think in Americans, too, Americans have gotten interested. Whether this translates to American interest in foreign policy, American interest in the world, whether people think about the U.S. role in the world, I'm having a much harder time understanding that. I can't tell you, I keep running across Americans who tell me, this is a 3,000-year-old problem. It's not a 3,000-year-old problem. It's a relatively...
Well, to that point, I used to talk to Senator George Mitchell, who was our envoy on this, got so frustrated, and he said his response was, hey, call us in 400 years when you get over these religious, fanatic wars. But, and he was basically saying there's nothing that can be done. I know you don't share that view, but that view's out there.
But this is a problem of nationalisms, right? And nationalism is a relatively recent phenomenon in the world. The issue of Jewish immigration to Palestine is quite recent, obviously influenced by the Holocaust. But this is a relatively recent problem, which I think has no perfect solution, but certainly ways to improve the situation. Again, whether Americans say they've been fighting for 3,000 years, they'll be fighting another 3,000, I don't care, or whether Americans say, this does affect our security, or whether Americans say, the U.S. can do things that nobody else can do. I don't know where people come out on this. I don't think the president knows, but I don't think the president is thinking in those terms. And certainly one of the interesting things, and you know this much better than I do, I think within the government, the position Joe Biden is taking is a position that used to be the standard U.S. government position for decades.
Right, very conventional.
He's been, in the Senate, 50 years ago he joined the Senate. This was a sort of mainstream position. It's not a mainstream position anymore. You have an increasing number of younger and more diverse government employees who say, what's happening in my name? I don't know where that breaks. I think certainly in the U.S., communities of color and younger people are in a very different position from where the president is. How that shapes U.S. foreign policy.
Well, this begs the question of what happens after. You have Tony Blinken saying Gaza cannot be occupied again. Gaza cannot be shrunk again. You have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu coming out and saying, we're going to determine every security aspect of the future of Gaza. What is, as you begin looking at a place where the schools have been bombed, the roads have been bombed, the infrastructure has been bombed, what's going to happen to this 140 square miles, which you wrote so eloquently about afterward?
Which is twice the size of the District of Columbia, 2.3 million people. There will have to be reconstruction, but frankly, people don't want to reconstruct things, only have Israelis bomb them again. There's going to have to be some sort of understanding with the Israelis. Again, this is why I think there needs to be an Arab role, partly to do some financing, and partly to do some policing, and partly to do some governance support, and partly to legitimate that this is not a foreign imposed solution, but an Arab solution. There's going to have to be a role for the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority can't effectively govern the West Bank. It can't take over a hostile, conflict-affected region in Gaza right now. There's going to have to be a lot of people coming together. The U.S. can't do it, but the U.S. can help coordinate. Again, this is where I think we're going to see this sort of the sustained unique ability of the United States to do these kinds of hard things. I think there's going to be a whole set of transitions in Israel. I think there's going to be a political transition. A lot of the people who were responsible for security before October 7th are going to be sacked. There's going to be commissions of inquiry looking at all the failures that went into it. I think Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to be the prime minister when all the dust settles. I'm not sure who will be. I would like to think that you're going to have an Israeli government that says we have to rethink how we're approaching this. But I'll tell you, when I speak to both Israelis and Palestinians, people tell me after what we've seen in the last month, the people who are arguing for coexistence haven't been empowered by the last month of hostility. The people who argue for coexistence on both sides
Right.
are saying, look at who these people really are.
Right.
And so we all have a journey ahead of us.
Let me just ask you finally, did Joe Biden make a big strategic mistake when he came in? He sort of largely ignored the Palestinian side of this. He said, we're going to focus on Asia, the pivot to Asia at the time, which, hadn't anticipated what had happened with Ukraine. But, I think more deeply, you'd seen the Trump administration lay the groundwork for the Abraham Accords. You saw Jared Kushner run this, and it largely ignored the Palestine question, just sort of shoved it to the side. And a lot of people thought, of all people, Joe Biden, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a kind of rival, if you will, to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu over time. They didn't like each other, that he would come in and reset things in a way that would include a horizon for Israel and Palestine again. And a lot of people think that was an opportunity miss. So did Joe Biden make a mistake at the beginning of his administration that in part contributed to this environment?
I don't think so, because you can't make a peace agreement unless both sides feel some urgency and necessity to make a deal. When Joe Biden came in, neither side felt either an urgency or a necessity to make an agreement. Mahmoud Abbas wasn't interested. Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't interested. And I think, the U.S. can sort of push and push and push and try to, but the conditions did not lead either side to say, this is really unacceptable. And so I think you try to prevent doors from closing. Certainly nobody wanted a catastrophe like October 7th to happen. But if you don't have partners, one of the things that U.S. officials have said a lot in the past is the U.S. can't want peace more than the parties themselves. And I just don't think it was a good environment. I think now people do see the possibility of environment, but there's a lot of building that's going to have to go on to get there. And part of it is you have a profound leadership vacuum on both the Palestinian and Israeli side. And we're going to have to go through political transitions on both the Palestinian and Israeli side to have an agreement. Working toward an agreement can help be part of that process. But there are no leaders now. Maybe this conflict will help create some leaders who can take us to a better place.
Is Hamas going to survive in this future plan, or do you think Hamas will be decimated?
I think the flames of Hamas will go away. The embers of Hamas will remain, and the only way to extinguish the embers is to have an alternative that gives dignity and some sense of self-determination to Palestinians in Gaza. And the Israelis have up to now been very reluctant to do that. I think it's in their profound interest to change that view.
Well, Jon Alterman, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? The battle over a homeland has been going on for a century, and with the support of the West, Israel has been the dominant power, setting the agenda and dictating the terms of engagement. Now the world needs to figure out a path where Israel feels secure and the Palestinians, well, they need something to look forward to. That means nations around the world, in the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and of course the United States, are making commitments for the so-called day after. What we are seeing unfold now with the deaths of so many who do not deserve their lives being snuffed out won't just matter to Israelis and Palestinians, but will have major long-term consequences for America's place in the world as well. And that's the bottom line.